We're going to start with the hottest topic on the planet right now, which is COP26. So this is the kind of big global climate conference that's happening in Glasgow in Scotland in the UK, not as CNN seem to think it is in Edinburgh in Scotland in the UK, which is quite amusing and quite bizarre. But Glasgow is hosting over 200 countries from around the world, talking about the impact of climate change and the very serious threat that's looming with this. Now, COP26 obviously is focused on what's happening on the Earth and the devastating effects that we're seeing already with climate change, and some nations, representative nations like Bangladesh, etc., are really starting to feel the impacts of this. So the whole argument of is it real or is it not real? It's real. One of the key things with the whole of climate change and climate observation is the role that satellites play in this, because satellites obviously give us some of the key data that we get in terms of monitoring things like glacial changes, sea states, even plastics in the ocean, whale migration, deforestation, which was a hot topic in the last few days in terms of how many acres are being lost in places like the Amazon, and these commitments now from various government bodies to say that they're going to stop all deforestation. We believe it when we see it because we've heard promises like that before. But it's interesting, we've got currently 4,550 active satellites now in orbit around the Earth, not including the 130 to 180 million pieces of debris, but active satellites, over 4,500 now. What's interesting out of that 4,500 satellite list is only 680 approximately are being used for Earth observation, scientific Earth observation, obviously, and spy satellites as well. So of the 4,500, 2,800 of those are from the United States. Only 167 satellites currently orbiting the Earth are Russian. Around about 430 are Chinese, and then about 1,150 or so are all of the other nations around the world. Now, the IPCC, the international kind of intergovernment body that talks about climate change, really focused on the importance that satellites play. As I said, if you wanted to monitor deforestation in certain regions around the world, it's next to impossible to do it on the ground. It could be due to a whole number of reasons. Accessibility, it could be really tricky to get there. Obviously, low altitude flights over some locations are next to impossible. Certain nations don't like you flying over them at low altitude. Some of our NATO enemies, as it were. We'll go on to that in a bit, in a while. But the use of what's called GIS, Geographic and Global Information Systems, which has been, for decades now, a really key part of what we're doing with science, is all being generated by satellites. And yet, they're talking about the impact of climate change and the impact of this and the impact of that and the financial impact, obviously, of climate change, as well as, the actual ecological disaster that's happening. And the irony of people like Jeff Bezos flying in on a private jet and then having a multi-car motorcade taken from the airport doesn't escape anyone, I hope. It's just ridiculous. The carbon footprint for this conference is just ridiculous anyway. But what people aren't really focusing on, it's quite upsetting in some respects, in that European Space Agency do have a fringe event and fringe kind of setup there, not in the main conference area, but in the green zone, etc., and the kind of key areas where a lot of the delegates will be focused. There isn't much space activity or awareness of what space is able to bring to environmental and climate monitoring, and also the effects of what will happen if it all goes wrong. And it kind of brings us back to our oft touched on discussion of collision events and this whole thing with debris, and we're throwing up more and more and more and more satellites. Terry and I were talking just before we went on air, and Amazon have now started launching their satellite constellation, which is 3,200 to 3,500 satellites. China's 13,000 satellites are now, well under planning. Starlink is gathering at pace. Last time I looked at the UCS database a few months ago, it was 4,100 satellites. Now it's 4,550. So we are clearly launching at a staggering pace. The other thing that's been talked about quite a lot recently is space weather and the impacts of space weather. There's an article just today on the radio, on Radio 5, talking about the impact of space weather. And it's a real thing. People go, what's space weather? Well, our nearest star, the sun, is emanating a lot of plasma. And we had a really nice ejection on Halloween just a few days ago. If you're listening on catch-up, or if you're listening live, it's a few days ago now to Halloween, which caused auroral displays in lots of parts of the UK. So the sun is very active, and as it's now kind of getting closer to its normal levels of activity. So we've had a really quite quiescent period with the sun for a good few years now, but it's getting back up to normal activity. The impact on these satellites could be again catastrophic, and I just hope that the governments around the world are seeing this and seeing that environmental impacts and disasters, if we want to avoid the real one, we've got to avoid this space disaster happening. Because if this happens, if this Kessler or catastrophic solar storm event happens and it knocks out so many of our Earth observation satellites, we won't have the means to monitor and validate if these countries are keeping to their plans. Countries that say that they're going to reduce their coal emission or the coal use, etc. We won't be able to check this. So it's an incredibly important thing that I just hope, if anyone is listening who's up at COP26, we've got lots of friends in various parts of the space sector I know do listen and catch up, etc. Please try to reinforce this. Our new science minister in the UK seems extremely good. Seems to really know what he's talking about. So it's people like that we really need to impress this upon, that they need to understand, yes, the benefits of space. There are huge benefits in terms of Earth observation, but just throwing up masses of constellations to try and compete with Starlink is not one of them. I don't know, Terry, thoughts on the whole COP26 fiasco? Conference?
Sorry, I'll ignore that. Although I tend to agree with you. It's not just sort of keeping an eye on what other countries are doing. It's actually very, very important for each country to see how they are managing themselves. I mean, it's essential now for agriculture. Satellite imaging can tell you, for example, whether there's a mineral deficiency in one half of your field and you need to apply fertilizer there, not on the other side. So there's so many things now that the satellites are essential for. And if any countries are genuinely trying to live up to their promises, whatever promises they make as a result of this conference, they will need satellites really to make sure that they are delivering. There's so many things. An awful lot depends on ocean currents and so on, for example. And that's really the only satisfactory way of monitoring those from space. But I think in agriculture in particular, because it's a great contributor to not only CO2, but methane. And to monitor your agriculture on a large scale, the only way to do it effectively is by satellite. So if we lose the satellites, as you say, not only can we not know what other people are up to, we can't even see what we're doing ourselves. So it is absolutely essential that we mitigate against a possible Kessler effect.
And it's interesting as well that Elon Musk has announced that he's going to donate $6 billion to kind of help end world food poverty and, help with some of these impending disasters. Now, it could be a PR stunt or it could be a genuine thing. Who knows? But I mean, it's a welcome amount of money. But then, $6 billion from Musk, $2 billion apparently has been promised by Bezos. It sounds like huge sums of money until you put it in the context of other things that we like to spend our money on. Like in the UK, we're currently spending £110 billion, which is around about $150 billion. On a train line called HS2, which is also decimating ancient woodlands and ancient trees. So that's one issue there. And then the US Department of Defense's budget last year was $718 billion. Now, $6 billion, as I said, it's a fantastic amount. Please, don't get me wrong in terms of it's wonderful to see these space billionaires donating, or two of the richest people on the planet donating some of their money. And you only have to look at obviously what Bill Gates has been doing for many years with his attempts to try and curb malaria, for example, Bill and Melinda Gates. But we've really got to put this into context to really solve these issues. A few billion here, a few billion there, whilst it is a great start, is not going to solve these problems. And the UK space program, for example, the amount of money that's been invested into that is only in the tens of millions from the UK government. And apart from OneWeb, which is a satellite constellation of over 600 or 500, 600 satellites aiming at competing against Starlink and giving us sovereign GNSS capability, which we already had with Galileo before we pulled out of Brexit. So the impacts, without getting too political, we've really got to step away from the politics of this and look at the science. The scientists are the people who are leading the world in terms of, COVID response is science. Science has saved us. In terms of the climate impact, it's going to be science that saves us again. if at all, if we're not too late. So please, politicians, please start listening to the scientists, because we need you. We need you to.